Welcome to Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose. I'm Deremy Dove. I'm joined by the man, the myth, the legend, the hardest working man in show business, Mr. Jose Ruiz. What's going on, man?
Deremy Dove, what's going on, my brother? How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good, man. Just coming off of a nice Memorial Day weekend.
Yes,
So it's
yes.
good to start the week going by doing this show with you.
Yeah. No, I had a nice restful weekend. I don't know how your weekend was, but I didn't get any barbecue, man. Like that sucks. Like not
Oh, you
even
didn't
a
get
not
it?
not even a burger, man.
Yeah, I kind of did that on. I got some chicken. Actually, no, I had barbecue chicken.
I didn't
So I
get
did get
shit.
some. You didn't get nothing?
Nothing, dude. I was ordering pizza yesterday. I was surprised the
Ah.
pizzeria was even open, but the dude was all mad when I went to pick it up. I was like, I'm surprised you guys are open. He's like, I am too. I was like, oh, all right. Thank you.
He's like, "Why'd you order?"
Yeah, I probably messed everything all up. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But no, it's interesting because hockey is something that you're a big fan of. I love hockey history. So we do when we do these hockey episodes, it's fun because we don't do them that often, but we're both
I
on the same
know.
wavelength. I know, but we're on the same way when we do them. Like they are like ones that matter to us, and I feel like they're special. And this is in the same category. This episode.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that comes from this, what we're going to talk about today, Jeremy, and just how the entire like National Hockey League, like how it shifted from this moment on, and it's so there's so many different layers that go into this. There's so many different twists and turns, I guess you can say, like on the impact of what our episode topic is today. And I'm excited to talk about it. I'm excited to talk about anything hockey, obviously, but this one here, it's a really big deal, even if you weren't a hockey fan at the time. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I'm saying? Like I think it's a huge, and I think that in itself says a lot. Like it crossed over to National Enquirer type stuff. Like and it was that big of a deal, Jeremy.
So we're looking at the Gretzky trade, which will be on its 35th anniversary in August of
Yep.
this year. And what's interesting is, and it's going to be something that we're going to kind of put on trial and kind of talk about throughout. And at the end, we'll give our answer. But you can make a case one way or the other that this is the greatest trade in pro sports history, the Wayne
Absolutely.
Gretzky trade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't even think of, because there's no way, and you hear this in sports all the time, like that you could get equal value, right, for like a superstar, or in this case, like a mega star, right? Like there's absolutely no way. There are certain trades where you look at, and I will get into like a Herschel Walker trade, right? Like that, he was a great player at the time, and Dallas got a boatload of assets. Eric Lindros, that trade, we did an episode on that. Check the archives,
Check
and
them.
and we, there's no way you can get equal value for these superstars. And this trade definitely was like that as well. Like there's no way you can even come close to getting equal value for someone like Wayne Gretzky at the time, where he was just an all-time iconic, amazing player. So, um, yeah, there's a lot that goes into this. So for sure, I'm excited to do this.
Absolutely. And so we have to look at it because we can kind of see, and I know this is why you wanted to talk about it, is because two reasons. We look at the Edmonton Oilers today, and they have arguably the best player in the game with Connor McDavid and what he's doing, and kind of really bringing Edmonton back into the talks of the NHL, which they really haven't had since a little after this trade. Edmonton kind of hasn't been that popular of a franchise. And then we look at the Stanley Cup playoffs and who's remaining, and it's all these warm weather Sun Belt type franchises, which you can really look at and say is a direct result of this trade, which we'll talk about.
Oh my God, yes. And so yeah, to go back to your first point, we're talking about the Edmonton Oilers, today's era, today's generation, and yes, Connor McDavid is the best player in the game, hands down. Like I don't think there's an argument there. There's guys like Nathan McKinnon in Colorado, who I really enjoy watching. He's a great player. They have there's a ton of great players in the league. Leon Draisaitl, who's on Edmonton as well, he's another great player. I think he was like 2019 MVP of the league. So um, there's a lot of excitement in Edmonton today, and I think the excitement in today's kind of like era and generation is will kind of match what happened with Gretzky in that era, right? Like they were. Now the difference is I don't think Edmonton's the best team overall in today's game, but they're definitely 100% the most exciting team to watch, and they're a couple players away, right? Like goaltending is always been a little suspect with this team. Defensively, like they're okay, they're just not good enough. But when it comes to offensively, the power play, like they have a historic power play, like especially in the playoffs. I think they were at like over 30%, which is an amazing clip to be at. But when you have those two top players in the game, and then you have a few other, I mean, you have Ryan Nugent Hopkins, who was a number one overall pick a couple years back, who was sort of a bust. And then, the last couple years, he's really took off because, again, a lot of the pressure's off him and on McDavid and Draisaitl. So many great players on this team today. And again, so excited and such an exciting team. And the NHL is definitely doing a great job on like putting them out there, putting them on a lot of primetime games on ESPN, TNT, which is definitely helping out the league as well. But I think it just kind of made me think about it there. I mean, I know you kind of touched on it too, on like the excitement of this team today and how it hasn't been there for a long time. Like they had a couple runs. I mean, you talked about it. I know Chris Pronger was on the team one time. They had Doug Wade, Ryan Smith was on the team, and they had a little like a Stanley Cup run, but you knew like this was just like a 1 year thing. Today it's different. They're going to compete for a Stanley Cup every year.
So I want to also like take everyone listening back to pre the trade, pre what was going on with Edmonton, Gretzky, and just honestly to give people, cause I feel like Wayne Gretzky, due to the NHL kind of going up and down in popularity over years,
Yes.
and Wayne Gretzky is more visible than some other sports icons, usually. But the thing is, for me, and I know, you as well, Wayne Gretzky was on that level of MJ, of Pele, of Ali, Babe Ruth. He's on that Mount Rushmore of great sports icons of all time. And I feel like that kind of I don't think it'll be forgotten. I don't know how to write the right words for it because I think like everyone knows Gretzky, greatest player ever, but it's like he doesn't have the aura that when you say MJ and Michael or Ali, like that doesn't happen anymore. And for a while in the 90s, there was always a saying that people would go, Wayne Gretzky is the Michael Jordan of hockey, and then people would flip it. No, it's Michael Jordan, the Wayne Gretzky of basketball. Like people were saying that for a while in the 90s, and now I feel like that's kind of gone away. So I want to talk about just even up until pre 88, this guy was already GOAT status.
Yeah, which is, I mean, his nickname is the Great One. I was thinking about that this morning. I was like, man, like that's an all-time great nickname.
It's literally with Ali and like the greatest. You know what I mean?
Right. And to be called that while you're still in the prime of your career, it's not like this was 88 he was at the tail end of his career. Like no, he is in the midst of his like the best years of his career. And to be already considered the greatest player of the sport already. You got Gordie Howe, who he was in process of this, in this year, obviously, but in the process of smashing most of his records. Gordie Howe was considered for a long time the greatest player of all time. You got Bobby Orr was also considered one of the greats of all time. And then we don't even talk about like the goaltenders, right? Like that's another. I feel like that's like another category.
Right.
But I can remember, and this is what to me like what makes you like an all-time like mega superstar. And I don't even want to say the mom test, right? Like, cause that to me is like a good one. Like, if a mom knows who you are, then you're pretty popular. But even for me as a kid, Hispanic kid growing up in the inner city, where there's no hockey rinks, right? Like, there's no one wearing, hockey jerseys or sweaters, right? Like, there's none of that going on. I knew who Wayne Gretzky was. You know what I mean? Like, I absolutely knew who he was. And the thing is, like growing up, I remember Wayne Gretzky as more of an LA King, right? Because again, I was really young, and when he was doing this thing in the 80s, I was a little baby at that point, and I knew Wayne Gretzky as a LA King. That's what I knew him.
Same here,
right? And I remember, that great Nike ad with Bo Jackson, right? When he was like, Bo knows this, and he was doing one thing, and then they come up to him playing hockey, and Wayne Gretzky slides up and just goes, nah, that's not happening. Like, that's Wayne Gretzky. Like, I know who he is. And, it's just, incredible for me to think like, like how people today talk about LeBron James and he's the greatest player, but that's always a debate. Like, oh, that's Jordan, and for me, like I'll throw in Kobe in there always. And but at this moment, there was no debate. Like Wayne Gretzky was the best player of all time in the NHL, and for him to have that already while in the middle of his career, to me, it's mind blowing.
So he comes in the league, and Edmonton joins the league from the what was that? The
WHL, yeah.
Right. So you got Edmonton Oilers, Quebec Nordiques, Hartford Whalers, Winnipeg Jets, all come in the league in '79. So Gretzky comes in there. So we can look at from the '79-'80 season to '86-'87. Gretzky wins 8 consecutive Hart trophies, which is league MVP. He 7 consecutive Ross trophies as like the leading scorer, 2 Conn Smythe trophies as playoff MVP, and had led the Oilers, and he was the leader, to 4 Stanley Cups in 5 years. So that's all from '79 to '88. He's doing this.
It's an amazing run, and we always talk about on this show, definitely bigger than the game. We always talk about like teams that are forgotten about, or maybe some players or coaches that are forgotten about. And in the early '80s, you had that great dynasty of the New York Islanders. They won 4 in a row. They won 4 Stanley Cups. Another dynasty that's definitely forgotten about. But this Edmonton Oilers team, for me, is probably one of the best teams in all of sports all time. Like this run right here. Not only like the success they had, but the amount of Hall of Famers that are on this roster is incredible. But I know we're talking about Gretzky here, but we'll get into the rest of this team in a little bit. But if you think about it, right, like you talked about everything he's done from '79 to 86, '87, and
well, I guess '88 at that.
Well, yeah, 88
at that point.
At that point, yeah. So I mean, even if you look at just his numbers, dude, like it's, and I always go to this, but with Gretzky, it's different. You know what I mean? Like, he did something nobody else has done before him, and I don't think it's ever going to happen again. And we always talk about records that'll never be broken. Everybody points to like the Maggio's hit streak and all that. Like to me, 200 points in the NHL is never going to happen again. I don't think. He had from that '81-'82 season, he had 92 goals and 120 assists for 212 points. Right, that had never happened before. 90 goals has never happened before Gretzky. 200 points has never happened before, or 200 points, excuse me, has never happened before. He goes from '81-'82, he does it, and then he does it in '83-'84, '84-'85, '85, and '86. Like, dude, like, and then in the year that he missed, kind of like quote unquote missed out, he had 196 points. Like, it's incredible that run that he had, and I can understand why by the point this trade is about to happen or talked about, he's the greatest player of all time because he was doing things that we've never seen before.
Well, going into this trade, so after the '87-'88 season, Oilers have won their 4th cup in 5 years. The all-time point scorer in NHL history at that point was Gordie Howe. He had 1,851 points in 1,767 games, which is amazing. That's why Gordie Howe's an all-time great. At that point, Wayne Gretzky had 1,669 points in 696 games.
It's like video game type of stuff. Like, how you have a video game and you create I used to do this. You create yourself in like what you thought you would be. And you're like this 98 overall with speed and all. That's Gretzky. That was Gretzky at this time. And he was ahead of his time, right? Like the league was not prepared for a guy like this. They were still like trying to beat each other up to death. And, he was not that was not his game, and he was more of a thinker. He was more of like an anticipator. Like, he made his teammates better while still being able to score. And I don't, that's a rare combination to find, and to be a great goal scorer and to make everyone around you better. It's hard to find. We got great goal scorers. Obviously he's the greatest goal scorer. He has the most goals, but if you look at guys like Ovechkin and things like that's a great goal scorer, but that's about it. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So Gretzky did so much more than that.
So to me, the equivalent can be, this past year we saw LeBron pass Kareem for all-time point. Now, Kareem played from '69 to '89.
Yeah.
And LeBron is still playing, but came in the league in 2003. So to me, that's like if LeBron breaks this record 10 years. In 2013,
Yeah.
LeBron is breaking the all-time, after like, 10 years in the league, he's breaking Kareem's record of all-time, like, scoring leader. Like, that's the only thing I can think of, it's like on that level. Like, it's just insane. Like, we've talked about at other times, like a little bit on past episodes, about Dan Marino in '84 and what he
Right.
did, 5,000 passing yards. Wayne Gretzky, that's pretty much like if Marino did that like 4 years, 4 out of 5 years, got 5,000 yards in the '80s,
Yeah.
like just blowing the game. We look at what Gretzky did, and honestly, and we kind of had mentioned it before off air when we were prepping, talking about this episode. We did our episode, which is crazy, 2 years ago, on the Red Wings Avalanche,
Yeah.
and how the Russian Five and that brought over the European game, and that changed hockey. But Wayne Gretzky is right along with it. If you combine like the Russian Five and Wayne Gretzky of changing the NHL and the modern NHL, what we see today, are comes from those two factors. And we're not talking, we'll get to off the ice what he did, but just on the ice, like Wayne Gretzky's playing style really changed the game.
Yeah, because again, like you're coming out. If you look back, right, you're coming out of, we're talking 81, right, 82 season where they really start to establish themselves as he does, obviously as the best player in the league for sure. But this is not the best team in the league for the most part. But you're coming out of an era of like the '70s, and you mentioned Broad Street Bullies when we were talking earlier, Deremy, and like we're coming out of that era, right? Like that where if you can't score on someone, you're going to try to kick their ass, right? Like that's and you want to try to intimidate them, and that's what a lot of don't get me wrong, that Flyers team, which we'll eventually do an episode on for sure. They had a lot of great players. Well, they had great players. I want to say they had a lot, but they had some great players, right? They had some great goal scorers. They had some skill on that team, right? It gets overlooked because they were just beating the shit out of everybody, but if they were intimidating you though, you know what I mean? Like, and
Right.
then now, like this is an era in the '80s where that's still in play, but now this Edmonton Oilers team is bringing a different type of level of play into this league, and for the most part until today. Now in the '90s that shifted, and we talked about that when we talked about our Lindros episode, where now at that point everybody wanted bigger guys, right? Like bigger, stronger. It was more of a hitting game. It was more a lot of clutching, grabbing. That's why like teams like the Devils had so much success, because defensively they were just so much better than everyone else, and there was a lot of like clutching, grabbing. You would dump the puck, and that was about it. This Edmonton Oilers team was up and down, right? Like they would, like there was a lot of passing and a lot of skill being shown, and again, the league was not ready for this, and that's why I think he had a lot of success, and I think that's why this team had so much success.
Mm. So now, do you credit that to him being just so ahead of the curve, or do you think or are you kind of saying that the league talent wise was a little bit down?
I think it's both. To be very honest with you, I think it's both. Like, because now you have those great teams of the '70s, early '80s, kind of like, like not being as like that Islanders team was just not as good. Moving into like the mid '80s, right? I mean, if you really think about like what other team was giving them a lot of pushback, you know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm not discrediting what they did at all. Like to me, this is one of I'll put this team up with like the '90s Bulls. You know what I'm saying? Like that's how I look at this team, this Edmonton Oilers team. But there were some good teams there, but the talent disparity that they had on this team and compared to any other team in the league, it was night and day. Like they did such a great job on building this team that it's almost unfair. You know what I mean? And we talked about like video game stuff with they had like the no trade thing on Madden. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like they're
Mm-hmm.
just getting everybody, but they didn't do that. They developed a lot of these, they drafted a lot of these guys, developed a lot of these guys. And I'm just talking about like not some like good players. Like I'm talking about like all-time great, game-changing type of talent with like Gretzky, Mark Messier was such a solid. He's probably the most solid player of all time, right? Like him, Eiserman, like all these guys, right? Like, but you had guys like Paul Coffey, who was offensively was probably one of the best offensive out of like Bobby Orr, like the best offensive defenseman of all time. Like he was putting up 140 points in this era. Like it's insane, like the talent they had. And but I think it's also a part of like what Gretzky brought, the talent, and then what the European style of play started to come in. So because they were playing, and this could be another episode. Like with them and like playing the Russians and like these Canada Cups and all that. Like that in itself was amazing hockey. But I think to answer your question, I think it's just a little bit of everything that just morphed into this perfect storm.
No, and that's what, as great as this team is, when you mentioned Messier, Coffey, Grant Fuhr, as a goalie, a Hall of Fame goalie.
Right.
You didn't. I think Glenn Anderson is on. He's a Hall of Famer.
Yari Curry, Kevin
Yari
Lowe,
Curry,
like Esa Tikkanen. Like you can just
yes.
go on and on and on with this team. Greg McTavish played 100 years. You know what I'm saying? Like, and he was a steady defensive face-off guy. The last person to never not wear a helmet in the league. That's why a lot of people remember him by. But they was just so deep, man, and good coaching. Like it was insane.
No, and just real quick, and this might be, it maybe it's hard. So but I'm just thinking now. If you look at the top 50 players presently of all time, like how many of them you think were on that Oilers team? Like in your opinion, like who you're like, that guy's a top 50 player.
I would at minimum three. At minimum, I would say Gretzky off the top of my head. Gretzky, Messier, Coffey, um, Yari Kirby might be in the tail end of that 50. He's a Hall of Famer too. Probably one of the greatest European players of all time. Um, I think after that, I think that it'll be a stretch to add anyone else. But three, if we're playing space, three and impossible, Darren. Three and impossible.
Which is just incredible. Like
Right.
I don't think people, and so like you said, it could be four. Yari Curry, I believe, scored 601 goals, and I think Gretzky got an assist on like 350 of them, something like that. Like it's insane that, and I just wanted to paint this picture for people listening, because this is what we're talking about leading up to the trade. You have the all-time team here in hockey history, in modern hockey history at least. Like you have the all-time team and this talent. Many people say Gretzky and Yari Curry, that's the best 1-2 punch of all time in the NHL. And some may debate that, but like that's up there. That's crazy that's up there. And that's not even like Gretzky and Messi. That's like Gretzky and Yari Curry as a 1-2 punch. So this is what Edmonton had, like the city. This is what the country of Canada had. Canada looked at this team with pride, and Wayne Gretzky was a Canadian prince. He was everything. He was the icon in Canada all throughout the 80s, where, I mean, his wedding to his wife, Janet Jones, that was put on TV. That was honestly the closest thing to like Prince Charles and Lady Di in the early 80s getting married. Like this was the Canadian royal wedding as far as they were concerned. So just painting the picture, this is the icon that Wayne Gretzky was leading up to 1988.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pressure that comes with that too. Like being that important, I think it was like compared to what the Packers are to Green Bay, where it's like the only thing in the city, and then when they play, everything shuts down, right? And they were kind of saying that, excuse me, that's how it is in Edmonton as well. Especially back then. I think now it's a little different with social media and the internet and all that, but back then, like I'm sure it was definitely like that. And right, and you think about all that pressure that comes into that, how important he is to the city, how important obviously he is to this team, and then you lead up to all of that important information, and then August of '88 comes.
Now let me ask you something real quick here before we get into like all this. You mentioning like Edmonton, and Edmonton was a working like city. It's a workman type of city. Even here like Edmonton and Calgary have a rivalry, and Calgary's more like the elite part. They're really close in proximity. Calgary's more like elite, and then Edmonton's more blue collar. Do you think if this dynasty say happened with, we know Toronto is a big city in Canada, if it was Calgary, if it was Montreal, big cities in Canada, do you think it could have changed something if like it wasn't in a workman type city like Edmonton? And no disrespect to Edmonton, but just we know big markets, especially at that point, like you said, pre-social media, pre every channels everywhere, you can stream everything. Big markets mattered in sports. Like, do you think if it was in a bigger Canadian city, that would have changed some things?
I believe so, and that was something I wanted to bring up too, Derek. So I'm glad you did as well. The big market, small market, it's a thing. You know what I'm saying? Like I know we always hear about that in sports, and people like to like not make it a big deal. Revenue sharing, that's why that was such a huge thing in sports, and this is why. You know what I mean? Like, and we've seen this time and time and time again for people to like continue to ignore it, right? Like this was probably one of the first times that you really saw that, like a team draft well, develop well, and become like a powerhouse, right? And then they can't keep it because they can't afford it. You know what I'm saying? And that was, and we'll get into the trade, but a big part of probably it was the reason why he was traded is because they were not going to be able to afford him. So you got to try to get something in return, right? And but we always look at like Oklahoma City with Durant and all of them. Like there's so many different like examples of showing how organizations like the Florida Miami Marlins, how they continue to like just develop great players and just lose them. You know what I'm saying? Because they
Mm-hmm.
can't pay them right now. Currently, Tampa Bay Rays, like they're one of the best teams in Major League Baseball. But in a couple of years, they're going to probably lose half this roster, like because they just can't afford these players. And at this point in time, now, and this is the flip side of like having a great team, that you have all this great talent. Now you got to try to keep everyone and keep everyone happy. A lot of these guys, for how great they were extremely underpaid. I think Gretzky was making like 250,000 a year or something like that, which is insane, right? If you think about, you know,
Right.
um, the level where he was at, and but they had to do that because again, that's the only way they were going to keep the teams. And then at this point in time, like they're like the talk of the league, obviously, and now you got it. And dudes are starting to make $1 million a year at this point. They're cracking that, or at least $1 million contracts, and now it's time to pay Gretzky, and they were freaking out on that. So
And now there was something in Gretzky's contract when he came over to the NHL that at the age of 31, he could become a free agent and go anywhere. So he's 27, I believe, at this point. But so that's 4 years coming up,
right,
which
that's
is
still a long
quick.
way. Yeah,
It's a long way, but it's like you gotta start. It's not where it's
right.
like he's 23 and it's like you don't gotta start. It's like you kind of have to start planning about that. Like it's coming up. Like it's not so far away. It's right around the corner. Honestly, like this guy will be 31 and we can potentially lose him and not get anything in return. So that is also a factor in the mindset of the trade as well.
Yeah, and that's my thing, man. Like I'm always I go back and forth on this, Deremy, and I want to ask you, I guess, this question. But do you? Because I'm a believer. Like, you know what? I'm just going to keep him until he's gone. You know what I'm saying? Like, and then towards the end there, if I know he's 100% leaving, then I'll try to like get something for him. We see this in sports all the time as well, like where there's pending free agency on the guy, and it's like, oh, from 2 years from now or next year, he's going to free agency. You might as well get something for him now, like. But you're never going to get value for these guys, like not even close to equal value. So I guess my question is there. I mean, like if you're in a position like this, right? And I know this one's kind of like super unique, but just overall, like if you have a guy where free agency is coming, and it's like, you know what, like do I get something for him now? Or do I just keep him and keep the success, and hopefully that changes his mind when he leaves? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, where do you
No,
lean to?
it's a good question. I believe, and it's funny because it always kind of lingers because it was around the time we started our podcast, The Last Dance, and
Right,
all those things. I believe typically I'm going to go with I trade them before because it's just you have to think about the team in long term. As fans, we're in the now, and even as fans, we may think about the future, but we're really in what's going on right now. But as an executive, especially as an executive, you have to think
right,
about the long term of the team, and that's what you're a big part of what you're paid to do is think about the present team, but also the future of the team too. And you don't want to be left empty-handed. That being said, just like The Last Dance, and I can understand, even though I kind of agree with Jerry Krause, they were getting older. This is different. These guys are all young,
right,
but I believe when you have a dynasty like this is once in a generation, once in a lifetime type of teams, like the Bulls were, like this Edmonton Oiler team was. I think you let that ride out because it's a once in a lifetime situation that you have. Is if they would have won one cup or something, it's like, oh, okay. But like they're 4 and 5 years and no end in sight.
Right,
I
right,
think you let that ride out. And honestly, you still have such a loaded team that you let it play out and you try to develop. And you have a guy, Glenn Sather was coach slash GM, and Gretzky talks about his father Walter was the biggest influence, but Glenn Sather was number two on just so he's a great developer of talent, great
right.
mind as well, helping to run your operations. So I just think you let it for this example, you buck because there's always exceptions to the rules, and this is an exception where I think you got to let this play out. It's just too good.
Right. Like if you get blown away by an offer, like a Herschel Walker thing, right? The important thing with the Herschel Walker trade in comparison was what Dallas did in drafting these players was the important part. Yeah, you can
Right,
get all these draft picks, but that doesn't mean that you're going to hit on all of them. Dallas hit
right,
on most of them. You know what I'm saying? Like, so when you get an offer, like, you get 3 first-round picks and this and that, it's like, okay, that's great. But if you don't hit on those picks, your future doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? Like,
correct.
so I agree with you in this particular instance. Like, I'm going to let it ride out. Like, that's just what I'm going to do, and then hope, you know what I'm saying? Like that the success, and again, this is from a fan's perspective, like you said. Like this is not an executive. You're right. Has to think 5 years from today. Like, and I understand that, but I just think this. I'm not making this trade. I don't care who it is. I understand that like they were strapped with cash and all that, but you got to try to figure something out. I would have traded Messier. I don't know, like what I'm saying. Like
Hmm.
you need something, trade somebody else, but I don't know. I always go back and forth on that because again, like I struggle with like just letting the guy go because again, like you're not going to get equal value, or if you do think you do, you better draft them. You better draft well with those picks that you got. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you that because that was
No,
on my
it's
mind throughout.
no for sure. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing because the Oilers owner Peter Pockington at the time, so he's generally looked at pre this trade as a good guy. He brought Edmonton to the NHL.
Right,
Um, the Oilers are a success now. From doing some research, when people who were around back then in Edmonton say it was very like the city was workman type, and the tickets there wasn't like a high price for tickets.
nope,
So you wonder because I believe Peter Pockington, and he says no, but I think everything kind of shows he was strapped for cash. He had some
right,
other businesses, and he needed the money
right.
because Jerry Buss, which is funny how all this connects.
Yeah, I know.
So Jerry Buss, earlier in the decade, he had, owner of the Lakers, owned the Forum, but also owned the Kings. And Jerry Buss has Showtime, Magic Johnson, the Lakers, all that, and he knows to get the Kings, he needs a star like Wayne Gretzky. So he asked Peter Pock. He starts it off asking Peter Pockington, "What would it take to get Gretzky?" And Gretzky said, "A lot of cash and your whole organization, pretty much." Which he's not wrong.
Right. Yeah, this was
Like
like
that's
'85, I think that was.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's where the Kings weren't good,
Right.
and that's how great Gretzky was. But a few years down the line, they get sold to this other guy, and there's a lot of like it's
Yeah.
shady people involved. But good old Bruce
Yeah.
winds up getting in charge of the Kings. Bruce McNeil, I believe, or
McNall. McNall.
McNall. So Bruce gets to be the owner of the Kings, and then which is weird how he's a coin collector.
He needed some time after all this too.
Yeah,
So
he was a very shady dude.
yeah, yeah,
So a lot of shadiness with these rich owners here, but he brings up the conversation again to Peter Pockington, and Peter Pockington, it's a few years later, he's a little more open to it this time. Jose,
yeah. I mean, because again, like something that you touched on earlier was the like potential of Gretzky being a free agent in a couple seasons. Looking at what he's doing financially, right, and looking at 15 million US dollars, which at the time I think it was like 18 and a half Canadian dollars.
mm-hmm.
So when you have a small market team like this, where I think I saw him in an interview, I think he mentioned like their tickets were like 20, $30, like, you know what I mean? Like something like that. And because he made mention to like our fans coming in paying $20, $30 to come see the team. And I was like, $20, $30. Oh my God, man. Like I would have season tickets like every year. But,
Yeah.
and and then even Gretzky made mention to in interviews where he's like, I knew people in the stands, like they've been there year in and year out, and they're just regular families. And to me, this one sports was great too. Not to like kind of jump off topic, but this was like real fans were watching the games, and it's not like the first 20 rows are like saved for like companies and executives, and they just live. You know what I'm saying? Like these are real diehard, dedicated fans, man. Like that's why those places you see in them old replays and stuff, like those crowds are going crazy, man, because these are diehard fans that are watching the game. But anyway, but I can understand, like from that perspective, I can understand, like if I'm not going to be able to keep this guy, if I'm not making as a lot of money, and this money is going to change not only my life, my family's life, and this organization, like I get why he was open to it at that point in time.
But and I'm not, and so I'm not someone who's great with like I'm not an economist or anything like that. I'm just wondering, and it's thing as a fan, I love that, like that it was cheap and everything. But from the other side, if you need more money and you're strapped and all that, why aren't you raising ticket prices?
Right.
I mean, I always remember the story my dad told. So he must have been like 21, 22 in 1974 when my dad likes hockey, big, hockey fan. So the Flyers won in 73, 74. And he told me, he said he can get front row that Stanley Cup season when they won their first cup, $7. He's in the front. And he's like, after they won that cup, he's like, I couldn't go front. No, I had to go way up. It was like 30 or $40 to be right in front ice. Like, and it bumped up that much.
Which I understand.
Right. So to me, that's what I'm saying. Why wasn't he doing that? Peter Pockington as owner of and I love, like you said, I love that as fans, Gretzky could say he saw the same families. So part of me hates even saying that, but just wondering if you're strapped for cash, there's ways to kind of do that as well. I'm not saying you would get 18 million Canadian dollars, but there's ways to kind of make that a little bit easier on yourself.
Right. Like there's a difference of like having the same people in the stands, or if your team sucks, like these people are not going to come. You know what I'm saying? Like, and well, some of them won't come. You know what I mean? And
a lot of them.
Right. So what's how do you balance that out? And I think, like you say, like you raise prices, you may raise concession stuff, like, things like that. But maybe he did. I don't know. And, and that still wasn't enough. You know what I'm saying? Like, because again, and he also talked about like how player salaries were changing at this point in time. And, they were getting up there into $1 million contracts where, some of these owners, especially these small market teams, were not going to be able to do that stuff. Again, to Gretzky, to Messier, Paul Coffey, all these other great players that they have, you got to kind of pick and choose who are you going to keep. And Yari Curry, like all these guys are going to want to start making the same money, or money that they see other players who may not be as good making around the league. And that's when like, because you can't always ask these guys to take a pay cut. Like you can maybe here and there to continue this run, but eventually you're going to have to pay these guys.
Absolutely. So it winds up heating up. And what's interesting is, according to a lot of reports, according to Gretzky, his dad, Walter, came up to him a couple hours after they won that fourth cup and said, I'm hearing rumors that they're going to trade you. So to me, that kind of shows this is brewing for a long time and just how serious it is. And I'm just wondering, Jose, when we can get into it more, but looking at this, hearing it right after you won your fourth cup in 5 years, all you're doing, you are Canada's rising star. Do you think when you see Gretzky saying even today that he wanted to stay in Edmonton forever, how much of that do you believe is true? Or how much do you think with, like you said, player salaries are rising, how much more pay cuts can I take? Edmonton's not even in Canada, it's not Toronto or Montreal or Calgary. Do you really think like he didn't have, how much do you think he really wanted to stay in Edmonton, or how much do you think he wanted to kind of spread his wings and see what else was out there?
I'm glad you asked because I'm always conflicted on this. Because you hear them kind of say both things. Like it's crazy because like watching interviews like throughout time, like you can there's so many documentaries on this trade, but in different like eras, right? There was one like not a couple years ago, that 30 for 30 that came out. I think it's like a King's Ransom or something
Yeah,
like that. And then, the day that changed the NHL, that's a different one that came out before. It's like you
that's a
hear
good
these,
one. Yeah.
that is a good. Then you got the Sports Century years ago, ESPN did like there's so many documentaries on this that, and then you see them in interviews, and then one interview they'll be like, well, yeah, I didn't want to go, things like that, and then another interview you'll see them, especially Gretzky was like, no, I told them it was okay to trade me, like, you know what I'm saying, like, and then it's just like, which one is it, like, do you want to stay or do you want to go? And I get like you will be torn, right? Because if you're that important in the city, you're that close to a lot of these guys, because this is not like free agency where guys leave every year. This is like you get this team and this is going to be your team for years. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, and it's I think personally, I think he was okay with because I think he was okay with leaving. I'll answer the question that way because again, like it goes back to for me too. Like when Jordan left to play baseball, right? And some say he was forced out, but let's just keep it like he left to play baseball.
Right.
And one thing he said was there's nothing else for me to kind of like achieve, right? Like he's won the championships, he's won all the individual accolades, like he had all those awards. I felt like Gretzky was in that same spot too. Like he had won 4 championship, well, 4 Stanley Cups, right? He's broken a bunch of records, MVPs, Hart trophies, all that, like Conn Smythe trophies, like you name it. He was he probably Lady Bing, probably like like all these awards, he's won them all. So when these great players get forced with a challenge like that, like man, going to LA and like creating a hockey culture in a California, I'm sure that had him like, yeah, I want to go do that. You know what I'm saying? Like, if
Hmm.
I can do that, I'm going to be remembered forever. And he did it. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
and that's why we're doing this episode today. So I think a part of me really felt like he wanted to kind of, like you said, spread his wings.
And just even as nice as it is in the moment, and even if we can appreciate it, I think all of us, not on Wayne Gretzky's level, but where hey, you're comfortable and you do appreciate or you like where you're at, but you're kind of you're bored, you've been there, done that, and you take into the fact that he's engaged, and then a month before the trade gets married to an up and coming actress, and they are a big, huge, legendary marlin of a fish in a small pond, where that's the top story is how long is her dress, this and that. He had to
Yeah.
have press conferences to kind of like calm some things down
Yeah.
about it. Like, I mean, your wedding gets broadcast live. Like, it's insane, and people are crying. People felt like Wayne, especially him being 19 when he started, or 18
Yeah.
or 19, like they felt like they watched him grow up like a son or a nephew. So, which, like you mentioned earlier, can be great, but it's a lot of pressure for someone. And then he's looking at now it's not just him, he's starting a family, he's getting married.
Right.
If hey, I kind of want to go and experience something different for me, for my wife, for my future children.
And he's already living in LA. So that to me, that mindset is already starting. Like, like trying to get away from this. And I can't imagine how much pressure that is. Like to be in like the number one person in this city. So it doesn't strike me as odd that he's living in LA at this time, he's got quote unquote up and coming actress. I never I don't know what movie she was in. I don't know. I don't know. I
I
think
think she's
Police
in Police
Academy.
Academy 5 or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
don't know how up and coming she was, but I'll leave that at that too. But it's funny. She had a quote where it made a whole lot of sense to me, and she was like, "Yeah, people act like I asked him to move to LA to better my acting career." She was like, "I was barefoot and pregnant for the next 8 years," and I was like, that makes sense. Like, what
She
I'm saying?
was,
Like she
yeah.
was. Like it's not like he moved out there and was traded and then she's in like The Godfather or something. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like
Right.
like that made a whole that kind of like for me squashed all of that like conspiracy theory stuff when it came to like now don't get me wrong, I'm sure she had like, look, I would love to live out here. Like who wouldn't? LA, Edmonton. I mean, come on now. Like it's LA,
Hmm.
Philly. I'm going to LA. Like so
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so again, like I get that, but to go back to like the point where it's just like for me, it makes sense for him to want to go do that. Like when you're that great, you take on different challenges, and that was, and probably in hockey terms, like the ultimate challenge, like to create a culture in the city where the Lakers are red hot. You know what I mean? Like red hot. You got the Dodgers who are good. You're going to be probably third in the pecking order every single year, no matter how well you do there. But if you can create a culture there, like you're a god, man. And then that's what he turned out to be. He became something more important than the actual league.
Well, let me add, because there's some things in doing research for this episode I've heard and I read, and I want to see what you think. Which is, if you look at the NHL in '88, I mean, I mentioned who Edmonton, Quebec, Hartford, Winnipeg. They're small in Canada terms.
Right.
You know, Calgary even is bigger, but it's not making a wave into America like the Calgary.
And a lot of
Flames.
those teams moved. You know what I'm saying?
Wound
Like
up, yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of people say for the impact that this trade winds up having, it has to, because at this point the NHL's in Canada, it's in the Northeast. There's nothing like west of St. Louis,
Right.
minus like the Kings, and they're floundering. Like there's really no hockey isn't out there. A lot of people say if you would have traded him to the Rangers, an original six team, a popular, in New York City, it doesn't have the impact. Like it's a big deal in New York, but
Right.
for changing the game, a lot of people say it doesn't have that kind of impact. It had to be LA. I wanted to know, do you agree with that?
I 100% agree with that. And I give Gretzky a lot of credit for this too. Like he had that vision, like, and it's documented, it's talked about, he's interviewed on it, where he knew it was better for the game for him to go to LA and kind of like establish himself there. And if he can establish his like LA as like a hotbed for hockey and things like that, or California on its own, like that's going to be better for the game. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I give the Kings a lot of credit too. Like they switched jerseys at this time. Like the color scheme, they went to like that silver and black kind of like Raider look, and that really took off because I remember as a kid, I wasn't watching hockey, but everybody had on King stuff because it was just a popular look and a hot look, and you saw it on videos and things like that. So, like music videos.
Yeah.
So I think honestly, it was the perfect move for I think it was a perfect move for him to do, and I think the trade was absolutely needed for the NHL, because again, like we'll talk about how the NHL has expanded, but what it did, there's 3 teams in California now. At this point, it was only the Kings. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it had to be done. Somebody had to be sacrificed, and unfortunately, it was Edmonton and their fans.
Now, Wayne Gretzky's the guy at this time. Do you think there's another player you could have done this and it had this impact with, or was it Gretzky and that's it?
No, it was Gretzky and that's it. Like now, if you tell me you can trade Mario Lemieux and he stays healthy, like throughout his career, maybe, I don't know, but no, it had to be Wayne Gretzky. There was no other choice. Like he was the only player who, again, was crossing over. You know what I'm saying? Like where you can see him in award shows, you can see him on the Inquirer, you can see him on TV. He was on, like, they had that little Saturday morning cartoon where it was him, Jordan, and Bo Jackson. Like, you're not doing that with any other NHL player. You couldn't do that with any other NHL player. So it had to be Gretzky, hands down.
No, I'm glad you brought up Lemieux because I know you're a big Lemieux fan. And Mario, to me, kind of had, in the 90s, he had some name factor too. But yes, I do feel, in my opinion, it's a different level. Wayne had it where I don't think Mario Lemieux had the Hollywood elites knowing who he was. And, it wind up becoming, when he gets traded, it's showtime. Like the celebrities all want tickets to see Wayne because they don't know hockey. They know Wayne Gretzky. And that's a lot of pressure, like you said. And he delivered, where the ticket sales through the roof, jersey sales through the roof. And it's the first time you really see it where, you could look at baseball, football at that time, definitely basketball, where you see that celebrity factor and, hey, look at who's at the game, this person, that person. But you didn't have that in hockey.
No.
And this trade and him going to the Kings was the first time You saw from Alan Thicke to Goldie Hawn and Kurt Rutt, all those people, they're at the LA King at the Forum watching the great one.
Right, because you want to be a part of that, right? You want to see greatness, and you want to see, like you. For me as a fan, I know I do. Like when one of my, we were talking about this earlier too. Like the Flyers currently are ass, like they're trash, right? But that doesn't mean I'm not going to watch them because again, what I want to be a part of the rebuild as well. And like how that sounds weird, but I want to say like, yeah, I saw this from here to like where
For
it's at
sure.
today. You know what I'm saying? Like when, especially if they become successful, I think a lot of people in LA just wanted to be down with that too, and I also wanted to be seen. Like that's also a thing too. But like I just think when it's something exciting like that, like you want to be a part of it. You want to be a part of it right from the very start. And they were not a good team. And the crazy part was when they were talking about this trade, and I'll give both these owners a lot of credit. Like he was very involved in like these negotiations. Like he was telling them who they like. He wanted to add more. They wanted to trade him for a bunch of picks, bunch of players, and he even said it like, "Hey, I need some guys here on this team too, like to be successful. I can't do this on my own." So now you get a Marty McSorley, and I'm not saying Marty McSorley was this great player, but he was a average NHL player. He was you're going to be able to plug him in and leave him in.
He was his enforcer.
Now that's another thing too. Like so you were going to be able to plug him in. They had Luc Robitaille already on the team. They had Kelly Rudy on the team already. Like, and Luc Robitaille is a Hall of Fame player as well. So they had a few pieces, but you add Gretzky, and then you got guys who are going to want to come to LA now to play with Gretzky. So that's another part of this trade, like that people don't understand. Like when you get a big time player like this, other guys want to go over there and play with you, and that's what happened. He started bringing guys from Edmonton, and then next thing you know, they're a successful team like almost immediately because of Gretzky.
Now, that trade officially happened August 9th, 1988. There's reports saying that, because how Gretzky looked and how nervous he was, so reportedly going into it, Peter Pockington pulling him aside saying, if you don't want this to happen, it won't happen. Do you think there's any truth in that, or that's just all folklore and talk? Like, do you think like there was talks of the last hour it not happening, or do you think like this was going to happen and it was just people want to say that?
I mean they're all three saying it. Glenn Sather saying it too. So now if it was only Peter Pockington saying it, then I would have thought it was suspect because he also made a comment during like the press conference, which was like the saddest press conference I've ever seen. Like I've seen some players retire and be like super emotional, which I totally understand that. But they look like somebody passed away, like in this press conference, and everybody was crying, and reporters were giving them a standing ovation, and it was nuts, man. But I can see how that could happen, because again, like you can tell they did not want to make this trade. It just came down to financially they had to. I don't think I think if they were doing well financially, this trade doesn't happen. There's reports where Glenn Sather pushes the owner, you know what I'm saying, like shoves him, and he say he wanted to punch him like when he told him about this trade, which I wanted to ask you this too. Like I thought it was kind of weird that the owner is making like all these moves and now he owns the team, so he do whatever he wants. But you don't go to your GM and like, hey, like he went to him after like everything was kind of pretty much done, and then Glenn Sather came in and kind of like completed the process. But I don't know. I thought that was kind of weird that the owner just made these phone calls and was like, all right, we're going to trade this guy and that's it. Like without consulting with the GM, unless he knew the GM was not going to be on board with it. What do you think there?
No, I can totally see it. That's why I think we're getting a little bit past that now in today's world of like celebrity owners are a little bit more known, but that always hit me growing up and even looking back. Owners make the call. So people will blame GMs and not that they don't have fault. They have whatever the power the owner gives them. But ultimately, it's the owner. That was my biggest frustration with the 90s Bulls in The Last Dance, which is Jerry Krause is acting on behalf of Jerry Reinsdorf, the owner. If Jerry Reinsdorf told Jerry Krause, no, we're keeping this team intact, right. Jerry Krause keeps them intact, and I don't think he would have done this. He then resigns. I'm not a part of it. But, In the Last Dance, I just bring it up again, just one more time, Blake. When I always looked at that part where the first episode when they're negotiating after the fifth title with Phil Jackson, will he come back? And Jerry Reinsdorf flies to Montana, does the deal with Phil, and then Phil Jackson comes back another year, and that was it. And to me, that's how it always is. Owners will set the precedent, they set the culture. So Peter Pockington knows his pockets better than Glenn Sather knows his pockets. So he's knowing what's going on financially, how he's struggling. The owners are talking to themselves. Jerry Buss reached out to him. Bruce McNall had reached out to him. So yeah, like a lot of times the ball gets owners have not just power on paper, they set the tone for the culture. And people
Right.
a lot of times forget that. And they'll blame a coach, they'll blame the player, they'll blame even a GM. The owner sets that tone. And he totally did it. And I'm not surprised because also Glenn Sather's close relationship with Wayne Gretzky personally. They have a close
Yeah.
father son type relationship. So not just player wise, but relationship wise, Glenn Sather's not going to be down with this. So Peter Pockington to me had to kind of do it this way.
Nah, that makes sense. That makes total sense to me. And that's why when we mentioned some owners, and I love how you talked about how the owner creates the culture. Like you talk about Jerry Buss, right? Like, and this trade happens because he's the one that originally initiated it. Why? Because he understood like the dynamics of having a superstar on your team. He wants to create that culture for this new
Mm-hmm.
organization that he's obtaining. Like you can look at all these other Jerry Jones, another one. Like people can say whatever they want to say about Jerry Jones. I wouldn't mind having an owner like that who's going to always try to move forward with his organization and bring in like the best talent possible. Like you can keep going, Robert Kraft, like all these other owners that always are aggressive. Sometimes they fail with that, but I would, as a fan, I appreciate that aggressiveness because you're trying
Mm-hmm.
to move this team forward. So I think the opposite can be looked at as like an Edmonton Oilers fan at this point in time, where it's like, no, you're like saving your own ass. Like you're selling him pretty much. You're not really trading him. You're selling him for $15 million, and I would have a tough time with that if I was a fan, which a lot of these fans most definitely had a tough time with. And so I think, yeah, like I get that point of view. I just thought it was odd, like again, that you do it that way, but it was done that way. By the time it got to Glenn Sather, it was a done deal. You know what I'm saying? Like it was nothing much he can really do.
No, nothing much he could do. And I look at it and I'm not sure if it's but it's pretty much so you give him $15 million, and I think in today's term it's over like 35 million.
If not more. You know what
Yeah,
I
if
mean?
not even a little bit more. So do you think Connor McDavid, if you're selling, is he worth 35? Is it less, more?
I
Like
think it's
looking at it.
more. Hands down
Okay.
more. Yeah, I think there's some people where I think there's some players that if you put them on your organization, I should be saying organization for this episode, but like I think it just changes everything, man. Like you know what I'm saying? You get you're it's going to grow merchandise, right? If you have one of these guys on, because what happens when you have one of these guys on, you're going to be on TV more, right? Like you're going to be video games. There are going to be more people playing with your team because again, like they're a better team. They have the best players, and the more players that the more noticeable players, right? Like that by name, right? So not only you're growing merchandise sales, you're growing a fan base outside of your city. How many times have we seen where like I wore Bull stuff when I was a kid. I love the
Yeah, me
Bulls,
too.
right? You know what I'm saying? And I didn't live in Chicago. I lived in Philly, so like that happens, right? Now you have fans outside of your, out of your state, out of your city, whatever, however you want to say it. So you're growing your organization by just this one player, by him being on your team. And like there's so many positives in having a player like this that if you can pay that money, like I say, you should do it. Now it's not my money, but
Right.
if I had the ability to do that, I'm going to do that as well because I know long term wise, it's going to even out, and I'm going to probably see a profit off of this just because this guy's on my team.
For sure, absolutely, and I do agree. I just wanted to see if you think McDavid, because that's a big statement that he's on a Gretzky type of level
Oh,
where
he's
he
100%. Look, and I don't. I have a Crosby jersey on. I'm not like a Pittsburgh. I almost said Pirates, Pittsburgh Penguins fan, but I love Crosby. I love watching Ovechkin. I love watching all these guys, and you know how. But this McDavid dude, like, this is something different that I don't know if I gotta be careful. I don't know if I've seen this before. You know what I'm saying? Like this type
In
of
hockey or in sports?
no, in hockey, in hockey.
Okay.
Like I I'll try to compare him. It's almost LeBron esque. Like it's like there where it's like you see greatness from the jump, like from the very start. You know what I'm saying? Like and it's like a different explosiveness. Like it's a different speed where it's an intimidating speed to pro athletes. You know what I'm saying? Like where he's coming down with the puck and dudes are just backing up. Like they have nothing else to do like than to just back up. And it's I haven't seen that in a very long time. You know what I'm saying? Like and I don't know if I've seen it at this level. With this type of NHL, with the type of goaltending there is today, shoosh, we might be doing a show on McDavid in like 5 years. I don't know. But
No, that's impressive.
yeah.
So now, if you look at it, so his first year's 88, 89 for the Kings with Gretzky. Um, he doesn't. He gets to the finals in '93, but he has some great years with these LA Kings. He
Yeah.
still has great years. But what people kind of forget or don't mention is that the Oilers do win another cup. I believe it's 90.
90. Yep.
So they do win a cup. So my question to you is there are the Oilers technically losers in this trade?
Oof. Yes, absolutely. Like 100% they are because again, you got Martin Gelinas. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like player wise. Now you had 3 draft picks. I wanted to look up who they drafted with those picks, but um Martin Gelinas was like a decent player. Like he wasn't I would say average. You know what I mean? And now that team was still stacked. The following year they lose to the Kings in the first round, you know, so
Mm-hmm.
that's even more ironic. But that loss propelled them for that 89 90 well that 90 season where that loss and Glenn Sather did a great job was and I you know it was who was I can't remember who was interviewed but they were saying when they lost that series to the Kings they were like look that's your buddy over there and he's sticking it to you you know what I'm saying like because I think that season was a rough season for that following season for Edmonton was rough because apparently like a lot of Messier was not on board with this trade and Messier is a pretty outspoken player. I'll give him that. Like he did it in New York, he did it in Vancouver. Like he was pretty outspoken, and apparently he was very outspoken here. But if you look at this team, they were still stacked. Like you know, you got Messier, so now Messier is your captain. Now you elevate Messier. You know what I'm saying? Into like he gets a little more playing time. Now all these other guys, Yari Curry's, and they get a little more playing time. But I believe Paul Coffey leaves after the season as well. So now you're starting to lose a lot of these players too because you can't keep them because you obviously shown financially you're not going to be able to sign Gretzky, but you're not going to be able to sign Messier and Coffey and Curry and Lowe and Fior and like you know
Yeah.
that's the Tikkanen. Like so you're starting to lose now all these players. So 90 they win it because again like I what was talked about was like how they lost to the Kings and that kind of like pushed them into this 90 season where they had a great season, great playoff run, and they won the cup. But then after that, guys start leaving. You know what I'm saying? I think Messier leaves after that season. I think Yari Curry leaves after that season. I could be wrong, but they leave closely right after that, and then that run is over. You know what I'm
But
saying? Like,
and I just say because we know long term, we mentioned beginning of the show where the Oilers were, but for like that run, Gretzky does not win a title in LA. He
no,
gets to the finals, but Edmonton does win. And I mean, I'm just throwing out devil's advocate, maybe like to Peter Pockington's credit, he knew it wasn't like, oh, I trade Gretzky, it all falls apart.
right,
He still has enough, like you're just saying, to compete and to win, and they did win the whole thing.
right. But how many more they could have won the season afterwards? You know, and I know Calgary was up and coming, and Calgary was a good team. You know, but then I really started to think, right? Like, all right, so they keep Gretzky. Let's just say hypothetical. Let's say they don't even win 89, right? They win 90. But now I'm looking at these other teams now in the NHL. What we were talking about earlier, where maybe some of these teams weren't as like potentially good enough like to play with these Oilers. But now there's some teams that are. You know what I'm saying? Like in that Calgary team was pretty good with Newendike, Al McGinnis, Theo Fleury. You know, like now they have a really solid team. You got Chicago coming now with Roenick and Chelios at Belfort in the early 90s. But now you got Mario coming, you know what I'm saying, with Pittsburgh and Yager. And that they had a stacked team too. That's where Paul Coffey went after he left Edmonton. So and we were robbed out of that too. Like if you really think about it, like Messier and I mean Gretzky and Lemieux, maybe a finals matchup. Oh my God, in '91 or something like that. Like
Yeah.
that would have been outstanding. But like I don't know if they go on this like 4 or 5 cup run after this. You know what I'm saying? Because now the league starts to catch up with them. So the reason why I say they lost is because they could have gotten maybe one more in this mix if they keep Gretzky. But
isn't that the flip though? If they're not going to be able to keep all these guys, you keep Gretzky, you no matter what, you can't keep all of them
right.
because the league, the Rangers would have put up big money for Messier in that 91 year. They would have 91, 92. They would have.
And that was a right move for the NHL. If we're being honest, like him
Yes.
going to New York. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like so. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And so like they couldn't keep he couldn't keep all these guys. The league is getting better. They're catching, which happens in sports. You have a dynasty. People are going to eventually catch up.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't last forever, and people start to watch, and they're gunning for you. He got that, 15 million US, 18 million Canada, and he got
18,
another
5.
18.5, 18.5. So he got that, and he did get another championship. And because you're saying that at most he gets one more outside of 90. Like, because we don't know about 89.
Yeah.
So at most, one or two more than what the one he got. I just think it's interesting. Like, I think the Kings definitely won. The NHL's the biggest winner. We'll talk about that. But I think Edmonton doesn't look as bad, in my opinion, as a lot of people might like to make them look. Like, as far as this trade, I don't think they look as bad, though.
See, I don't know. Like, I think the Kings won this trade, absolutely. But, absolutely, they won this trade. But I don't know. I just look at, I guess, what could have been, and, like, I think they all won, to be honest. I think everybody won. The Kings definitely won, because that just changed their whole organization. And, I just think Edmonton gonna win one more, maybe two more, and what does that do for them at that point? I don't know. That doesn't change anything. I think a bunch of these guys are leaving anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess, yeah, I guess. But the overall winner obviously is the NHL for sure.
Now we look at it. We see what happens with the success that the interest that Wayne brings into it. I mean, Wayne, it's a little thing. Like, he's hosting SNL
right
in '89, which is 2 years before MJ did it. And Wayne Gretzky's a hockey player, so that's how big. Like, Gretzky's hosting Saturday Night Live, so he's that. Which we even today, always in the near 50-year history of SNL, the biggest, hottest stars are hosting it. So never had a hockey player done that before,
especially at that time. Like,
right?
Yeah.
So that's just shows you like I said, 2 years before MJ does it.
Yeah.
Which is something to say. Like, like as big as NBA was growing, they bring Gretzky on SNL before Michael. So that's just funny to like look at. And people may think that's not that big of a deal, but that's a huge deal for a hockey player a hockey player now.
Yeah.
But in '89 to be hosting Saturday Night Live is a big one. And I just think Jose, I look at the 90s NHL now. I know that's when you fell in love with it. That's when I was watching it. And there's other factors. But I look at the NHL in the 90s as a boom in popularity for hockey. And I think this trade is the direct result of the 90s boom, as far as ESPN getting the coverage, as far as the Disney, Hollywood, LA. So then Disney does the Mighty Ducks, and you have a movie franchise based on hockey, with kids and bringing kids in, and they have cartoons, and they have a franchise in Anaheim, the Mighty Ducks. I mean, just talk about like what you see as like the results, even 90s, but if you want to go beyond, the results that this trade did to shift the sport in the U.S. We know it was big in Canada, but in the U.S.
No, you touched on a couple of them there, and then the league expands to San Jose, right? In the early 90s, I think 91, I think it was 91, 92-ish, around there. And Ottawa, they bring in another Canadian team. Then Anaheim, they bring in another
Mm.
California team. So at this point in the early 90s, you have three California teams. And then, some teams shift and move, right? You had Minnesota North Stars, who were a very popular franchise in Minnesota. They moved to Dallas, and these are not in like chronological. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, chronological.
There you go. I got stuck there, but
It's all
yeah,
good.
this is not in that order, right?
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to think about like the shift that what happens in the NHL. You got Quebec. They move from Quebec. They go to Colorado. They have a lot of success in the early 90s as the Avalanche. Like there's so many teams that move, and then you get a team in Atlanta, right? I mean, they eventually move as well. They moved to Nashville, I believe it is. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, you look at all that success. Now you have a team in Vegas who is in the Stanley Cup Finals this year. Like, there's so much that happened to the NHL and that expanded it. Now, some people were saying, then you got Florida. I didn't even talk about Florida.
Right,
Like, you
right.
got Tampa Bay, like Florida Panthers. You got teams there now, and
Yeah, there's a team in Seattle now, right?
the Kraken. Yeah, the
The
Kraken.
Kraken, which is weird.
I know it's a weird name, but again, that's another city that's kind of like thirsting a little bit for professional sports, other than the Seahawks. But like, there's so many now. Now some people say they've expanded too much, and it kind of dwindled the sport a little bit. But I don't. And this was like early on. People were talking about that in the '90s. I didn't feel like that, but what it mainly did also was bring hockey to all these cities, right? And I saw someone being interviewed, and they made a great point where it's like, you know, let's just keep it at the Kings, right? If you're a 13-year-old kid when this trade happens, right, with Gretzky, now you're interested in hockey. Now you're starting to watch hockey. You might even play a little bit of hockey, right? But now these kids become fathers, right, and or parents. And
Wow, yeah.
now you got a little bit of love from hockey when you were a teenager, and now you're a fan at this point. So now what do you do with your kid? Now you're bringing him into this, and it starts that whole thing. And now we're seeing that some of the best players in the league are out of California, out of these like warmer cities that develop because of a trade like this Gretzky thing, or the expansion that it created into other warm cities, and that would have never happened before. We probably would have lost a lot of these kids to baseball or something like that. You know what I mean? That where they can actually play all year round. I don't know how they do it out there playing hockey in Phoenix and things like that, because you had a team in Arizona, you know what I mean, as well. So it was such a domino effect that what happened with this trade for me that's made the NHL where it is today, where I think it's back to how it was in the mid 90s in popularity. Again, ESPN now is covering them again and showing games. TNT is now doing a
Right.
great job covering games, and they're trying to like mimic what they do with the NBA today. They have the NHL tonight. Like, it's just, they're doing such a great job on TNT with this, that now you're seeing a lot of these guys and the Edmonton Oilers, you know what I mean? Like, and McDavid and all of them being put out front for everybody to see. And I think it's growing the sport for sure. My only thing with this season is the teams that are left are like not. I wanted to see, right. I wanted to see Edmonton against like the Rangers or somebody like that, who were having a great season. Boston was had an all-time great season, and they lost in the playoffs. And now you got Florida and Vegas. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't know how sexy. I don't know if that's what the NHL wanted, but that's what they got. And you do still. And we were talking about small market teams at the beginning of this episode, Deremy, and I would consider both of these teams small market teams. Like, I don't know if that's good for the league, but that's what they got. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
So they got to deal with that somehow.
No, and I think it's interesting. I think always in sports you need a mix of new and upcoming teams, franchise, or even in college. I think it's cool if you get an upcoming university, that has maybe the great history of success in that sport, whether it be football or basketball, going against a traditional power. So I think if you mix in one of these teams, Vegas versus a Ranger, give me a mix of, the Bruins, the Flyer, Detroit. Like if the Red Wings, I'm just throwing out names, but those teams that kind of have something. Like I think that's always a great mix for a sport. Mike, I have a side note for you because I agree. ESPN in the '90s and now great coverage. TNT has been awesome. I love how they've mixed it up. Barkley on the inside the NBA doing the
Yeah.
playoffs. He's hyping up
Yep.
uh,
It's a big hockey fan.
yeah, he's a big. It's natural, but it's also cool that like that helps.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest, that reminds me when I'm watching. I'm a bigger basketball fan, as people listening know. But that reminds me. Oh yeah, tomorrow night, go watch that. Like that game's coming on tomorrow night. Like between Barkley and you, those are the two reminders for me. Like I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. But they were on NBC, and I'm not
Yes.
sure how much is still on NBC. Are they all that contract done? But
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not even sure.
NBC is a big network. Why do you think? I feel like the coverage it struggled under NBC, and I don't know how much of that was NBC's fault. I don't know how much you know, but why did it feel like it took this shift for it to kind of come back with ESPN and TNT?
Because I also think like with NBC, it wasn't a lot of games. I think it was just like a Sunday afternoon or something like that after NFL season was over. But ESPN, they're on almost every night. You know what I mean? Like, so I think it's just a little different with TNT. They're on almost every other night. Especially now with the playoffs, they're definitely on often. So I just think, you know, and a lot of like some of like the TV show hosts came from NBC that are on TNT are from NBC. You got Keith Jones and all those guys who are on NBC now are over in TNT. So I think that's great, but I just think it wasn't a lot of coverage. If I could be wrong, but I just think like I know they had like the Winter Classic and all that. That was cool, but even that is getting like a little played out at this point. And this is coming from a fan. Like I just think it's okay if they could be done with that for a little bit.
Yeah,
But no, I just don't. It's not like NBC had them on every night. You know what I mean? Like it just had them on once or twice a week. It was like I can't remember what they used to call it, weekly rivalry game or something like that. And it would be a lot of the same teams like Flyers, Pittsburgh, like a lot of those Rangers, Boston, Detroit, Chicago, like a lot of those teams. And I just think what ESPN and TNT are doing, they're just putting out all games like as usual, and they're just doing a great job with the coverage for sure.
is this trade, in your opinion, is this the greatest trade in history or the biggest trade, whichever one, if it's both for you or one or neither? But like, where does this trade rank for you as far as like the big four sports?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from a couple of different angles, right? Like, I don't think it's the best trade when it comes to personnel, right? I mean, aside from Gretzky, obviously, like there's been, I think the Herschel Walker trade and what that did for like Dallas and even the Lindros trade, what it did for the NHL as well, for both the Flyers, Rangers, Quebec, like did so many different things for that for all three. I mean, there's a team back in Quebec, but I don't know if they leave if they have Lindros.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how good the Flyers are if they get Peter Forsberg. Like, there's so many things that can happen. Or Lindros going to New York, what that does for the NHL. Like, so I think those trades like had impact on like organizations, but I think what this trade does, it's like it just changes a few things. It changes the whole entire sport overall, right? It puts the sport in areas where it would have never been before. California, again, we talked about like these warm weathers, like Sunbelt cities. It also did something for players, I think, too, where it's like, and I think I remember watching an interview. I can't remember who it was, but somebody from Edmonton, the Edmonton Oilers teams in the '80s, where it was like, if they can trade Gretzky, like they can trade me
Right.
with no problem. So I'm going to look out for me now, moving forward, and make sure I get mine. Before something like this happens to me, which I totally, totally, totally understand. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I think that also like player empowerment doesn't come until like this generation now, but I think that's like the first like seed planted in that where it's like I better make sure I can get the biggest contract with the most guaranteed money, all that stuff before my career is over. Because again, like they can do whatever. If they did this to him, they can do this to me in a heartbeat. So I think that shifted that point of view from players. I just think with both of those examples, I think it's crazy positive for the league. You know what I'm saying? Maybe not for the owners when it comes to like contracts and stuff, but I think from a fan's perspective, I think it's an amazing trade. I think it is the best trade of all time because this is, Ali doesn't get traded. Babe Ruth, we talked about there. I mean, he gets traded but it was so early on that like, what impact was that made? Now it changed the two franchises in the Red Sox and Yankees, but Jordan doesn't get traded in his prime. Like I'm trying to think.
I I can think of Kareem getting traded to the Lakers,
Right, right. Shaq,
and
even Shaq's
yeah,
trade, but I don't. I just think also Kareem wasn't liked, by a lot of people. So it's just the impact wasn't there.
no, right,
Like
right.
the impact was there when he on the court, absolutely. But I just think the impact with this Gretzky trade and how important he was to the league and everything, like it's just I can't find another trade that's more impactful than this one. What do you think, Deremy?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's separation. So greater is like I think the great when you say the greatest trade, it comes to the impact. At least for me, and some people may disagree, but greatest it comes to the impact with the personnel on the court slash field
Right.
slash ice. Like so, there I agree. It's not that like Herschel Walker was a greater impact where it affected the on the field play bigger.
Yep.
Um, and Lindros, like you said, did that. So there's other trades in that regard that impacts bigger. But I think, like, so for like to be called the greatest, but I think the biggest trade in pro sports history is this trade. Um, I think it just what it did. You can almost look for modern NHL. You can say before this trade and after this trade, which is incredible. Like, that it has that kind of an impact. It's not a rule change. It's
Right.
not, it's just this trade. You can look at a sport and say before and after how the league was so different in so many variety of ways. It's incredible. Like you said, or even, earlier, I forgot how many documentaries are and that I had seen before we had ever talked about this episode of doing it that I had seen over the years. Some were just about Gretzky, but so many that were just about this trade.
Yeah.
I forget that. And it's like this trade is up there as bigger than when the league did the 67 expansion. People
Yeah.
look at it like bigger when you expand, when you added teams like to this league and new job opportunities. It's like this trade is bigger in a lot of people's minds. So I think it's the biggest trade in sports history. And I have to say, and I always will give that to you, and you're a more knowledgeable and a bigger hockey fan than me. This trade reminds me of how criminally, which is crazy to say because he's the greatest player in his sport, underappreciated and undervalued Wayne Gretzky is in our, zeitgeist, in our lexicon, that he's not talked about all the time. And he should be talked about the way Michael Jordan is talked about. And the fact that he's not, I think this crazy thing is that Derek Jeter is more talked about and more
Yeah.
popular than Gretzky. And I'm not even trying to knock on Jeter. It's just criminal that that's the case.
Right. Right. And for our younger listeners, right? Like just think about the decision, and if you were around for that, and with LeBron James leaving
Mm.
Cleveland in his prime, and how big of an impact that was, just flip it and just say they traded him and sold him for $40 million to Miami Heat, and how that reaction was in Cleveland, on how they felt about him just leaving, and when him going back to Cleveland. And I remember that game was so crazy, and like you can feel the hatred in that arena, and it was very similar to what happened with Gretzky, or when like Jordan just left, right, and went to play baseball. Like the impact that had on us there, me as in the generation, where it was like, what, like he's leaving, like are you crazy? Like it
And
was as
that's a
big.
great point. Great point because he's bigger because that hit Cleveland. Jordan hit the league was sad. People were sad.
Right.
That hit Chicago greater. This is called one of the worst days in Canada, not just Edmonton, in the
Right.
country's history.
Right.
Is this trade, and this devastated the country of Canada. It hit Edmonton, but the entire nation was in mourning that their favorite son was being traded to those guys down south in the U.S., like
Yeah.
their neighbors down south. This was like treasonous. Like like I'm glad you brought that up. Like people were in mourning, like and not the whole. So imagine the entire country
Right.
feeling it. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, he was that important not only to the league, but to where, to the country where he came from and grew up at, and was a big deal from the age of like 8 or 9 years old, maybe earlier than that, until, because again, like, and we talk about this on the show all the time, where it's like we get a player and we see them develop from like a teenage years, 18, 19, come in the league, and you see them grow up. Like we talked about this with our Kobe Bryant episode, and it's just like we both saw Kobe from day one, even prior to high school and things like that, where you saw the maturation and the greatness just develop and develop and develop. I'm sure they felt the same way about that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like that was their guy. Like
absolutely.
that was their one. You know what I'm saying? And he just got sold. You know what I'm saying? Like he didn't get traded for Luke Robitaille and
That's true.
somebody else, and for he got sold. So to me that was a even like a deeper, like they just he twisted the knife in there. You know what I'm saying? Like, which I think would have been a harder pill for me to swallow as well as a fan.
Yeah, because that's also not to make it socioeconomic, but that's the thing of, we're neighbors, Canada and the U.S., but it's
Correct.
like those greedy capitalists down south. Like, so you sold him. So that's a great term because that's really what it is. The trade's just to like the other pieces were just to help Gretzky and to get something for it and not to look so bad in Canada. Because then it really is you sold him to L.A. to Hollywood, and it's like you're just chasing that almighty dollar. Like that's what those guys do in the United States. So there's even like that kind of factor as well. I just think Gretzky is, to me, he makes a case, not when you take greatest athletes, because he's not the most athletic.
Right.
He's not a specimen there. But as far as like, greatest at their sports, I think if you look at the icons of the icons, Michael Jordan isn't better at basketball than Gretzky at hockey. There's great cases to make for LeBron, Kareem, Wilt Chamberlain. Some people say Bill Russell. I can sit there and listen, and I can understand when someone says that for basketball. For boxing, many people will say Ali's not the greatest boxer. They may give him greatest heavyweight, but greatest boxer, you go Sugar Ray Robinson and Hank
Right.
Armstrong, on and on and on. Same with baseball, not giving it to Babe Ruth. In hockey, no one's not saying it's Wayne Gretzky. Like he's the guy, and I think that's where I'm just like the fact that he's not talked about more or he's not higher up on list as like the greatest athlete ever is shocking.
It is, but I think it's also to our original point with this episode. It's like what we look at is hockey. What we think about hockey. You know what I mean? Like I think if you ask somebody in Canada, they're going to, I don't think they think that way. You know what I mean? I just think for us in the States, where it's like Canada, I mean, hockey's the fourth best sport maybe now at this point. Always has been, compared to football, basketball, and baseball. Like it's just always going to be fourth. I know for some people, I think in some cities it's not like that. Um, but I just think that's a bigger part. And I think if it's you go to Canada, it's flipped. You know what I mean? Like I think he is the greatest athlete of all time to them. And I think Rick Riley wrote his autobiography, and he was saying like he couldn't even lift. He couldn't bench press 140 pounds. Like he was always
Mm-hmm.
one of the slowest skaters, and like like in practice and things like that. And none of that matters, man. He was coached from an early age, and his father did a tremendous job on teaching him anticipation and all this stuff. And when you can anticipate the game and you know look at a game through angles and not just physicality, like I think you can outsmart a lot of people, and I think that's he definitely did that. Now he had some great characteristics as a player as well, but I just think when you combine both of those, I think that's what you get. This, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
and you get the greatest of all time. So
No, but I'm glad we did this episode, and it's crazy. It's gonna in August we'll hit 35 years since this trade,
yeah,
and we'll see what happens with Connor McDavid and the Oilers, and if they're gonna relive this saga. And
they better
we'll
get some
see.
goaltending.
They need some
They
goaltending. They
better
need
do
some
that.
goaltending. But Jose, this is a lot of fun, man. I'm glad we did this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And let us know what you all think, right? Like all our listeners, man, if you think this is the biggest trade in the history of sports, if you do not think so, let us know. Where you can find us on Twitter and on Instagram at Bigger Game Pod, right? And then you can find us on YouTube at Bigger Than a Game with Deremy and Jose. Let us know what you think. What do you like? If you were around for this rescue trade, how did it impact you? Like, let us know. We would love to hear about it. And yeah, hopefully we can do some more hockey stuff for y'all in the near
Yeah,
future. Or in the
for
future.
sure.
I don't want to say near future. I think I'm asking for a lot, but in the future for sure.
No, and also like and subscribe
Yes.
for the podcast for on YouTube, Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose. So please do that as well. But for the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Jose Ruiz, I'm Deremy Dove. Thank you guys for listening to Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose.
Peace.